Well, today's show is going to be near and dear to Mr. John Gunnison and my heart, considering we are both from New Hampshire and we're about to get into New Hampshire, also national politics, with friend of the show from all the way back in the days of Clubhouse, Boston Globe national politics reporter, James Pindell. So before we get going, James, you're about a month out from a massive midterm election. How are you doing? Are you running on fumes?
It's odd. COVID is still a very odd time to be a political reporter. I want to be out. I want to be at big rallies. I want to be able to knock on people's doors. And obviously, people are emerging out of COVID and they want to attend these things. Democrats a little bit more hesitant than Republicans, but the nature of campaigns is different. And frankly, it's harder to cover. So am I okay? Yeah, I'm relaxed. Versus other previous midterms or elections where you're a little bit more hurried. You're going from airport to airport or, location to location. But I cannot tell you exactly what ads are penetrating and working with certain groups of people because it's so micro-targeted to their streaming service or to their social media feed. I cannot tell you exactly what applause lines are working because there are not big scale rallies outside of a Donald Trump rally. Candidates are campaigning differently. They're just raising money and spending a lot of money on TV or on, like I said, or on particularly targeted ads. So I am left being humbled. That's how I'm feeling humbled. That I think right now we don't really know exactly where we stand. And that is obviously true for the U.S. Senate.
So before we get into this, I have to ask a follow-up here. Do you think that this type of campaigning is here to stay?
On some level, yes. It is extremely efficient if you're a candidate. And look at what's happened in terms of the campaign finance world. Really bad people at raising money are raising record sums of money. It has nothing to do with aggressiveness. It has to do with email lists and what your fundraising team can buy you and what works and what doesn't. Are you considered top tier just by being in a particular state? So the incentives in the system where you would reach mass audiences, even through the press, it's much more niche and it's a collection of niches. So, there are fewer political reporters. There are fewer television ads, to be honest with you. They're nonstop, but the actual quality and the importance of them are different. And the game is being played at such a micro level again that it's hard, but at the same time, so cheap, so efficient. And the candidate's time is better spent doing other things. So yeah, I do think to a degree it's here to stay. I do think we're going to have more rallies and all that coming back because people want to experience. Politics is a personal business. It's about relationships. It's about the experience of politics itself. And so I do think that's going to come back, but with another layer here.
Awesome. And this is really the first of our October series of state level deep dives. So I'm going to kick it over to John to set the table for New Hampshire and specifically the unique format we're going to use for this podcast.
Yeah, I think the format won't be too shocking. Back in the Clubhouse days, we used to incorporate live audience questions from people who came to participate. And now that we're recording elsewhere, it's a little bit harder to do that. We're trying to find ways to get in a little bit more participation. And like Justin mentioned, both of us are from New Hampshire. I'm in a family of 8 people, and my whole family lives in New Hampshire for about 20 years. So I figured, why don't I write to my family and see if they've got any questions they want to know about our old home state. So I crowdsourced a few questions. We got about 4 or 5 questions from the family, and we're going to mix them in to the discussion, and we'll make sure we attribute any of these crowdsourced questions as we go.
So a throwback to our start on this podcast journey where we actually met James. So James, I know that you've spent time in Iowa, and I bring up Iowa because to our wider audience, they think of New Hampshire and they think of a lily white state, and maybe they don't know if it's the same as what you'd see in Iowa, Wyoming, and other white northern states across the country. So I was hoping that while John and I understand this, that you could walk us through some of the unique profile of New Hampshire and really what makes not only the voter in New Hampshire maybe a little bit different, but specifically the political experience that you touched on briefly, different in New Hampshire than anywhere else in the country.
Great. I've covered New Hampshire intensely for 20 years now. Started really intensely in 2002 when I moved to the state in Manchester. So apologize to the Concord and Stratums on this podcast. No state is a perfect representative of the country. There are states that are more representative of the country than others, but New Hampshire is uniquely not representative of the rest of the country. And when we begin this conversation, a lot of people say it's because of race. I'm going to table that for a second. It's obviously true, but it's not the main reason why it's not representative of the rest of the country. It is rich. New Hampshire consistently is in the top 2 or 3 of the highest per capita income states in the country. It is a very rural state and a commuter zone state. There is no major city. Manchester, of course, you guys know this, is the largest, but it's only about 100,000 people. So for context, it's South Bend. So I guess the next presidential candidate of the United States could come from Manchester. Unlikely, but nonetheless. But 50% of the 1.3, almost 1.4 now, million people live directly in 2 counties that are right on the Massachusetts border, and they are bedroom communities to Boston. Now, many of those folks may not go to Boston every day. In fact, another reason why it's so unique is that on age and demographics, if you want to narrow in on who lives in New Hampshire disproportionately, this is not everyone by any means. It is a white person who is married, who has a graduate degree, makes good money, and they're about in their 50s, and their job title would be consultant. Because it's a lot of people who are on their way to retiring, and so they're making the most money that they've ever made in their lives. They are highly educated, and some come with their families, but some are like, oh, the kids are now in college. I'm going to start to transition. It could be coming from anywhere, really. But that's sort of it. And I guess the last piece would be that, highly educated. So when people say that, oh, New Hampshire voters during the New Hampshire primary are very well educated, very well politically engaged, yes, the demographic of a highly educated, high-income person is a politically engaged person. And of course, there's the other half of the state, which we can get into. But it is 90% white, to go back, to put race back on the table. It is a growing Hispanic population. But again, we're still at about 93% white, I think is what the last census showed, which obviously is disproportionate. And obviously, because they're not in cities, disproportionate from the rest of the country, and because of the education and because of the income, that is not representative. Politically, and then we'll move on, it is a very divided state. It is representative of a swing state for that reason. Yes, it has gone for the Democrat for president 7 out of the last 8 times, but it is the only state in the country. And by the way, those are presidential elections that were all decided within 3 points, except for Barack Obama in 2008. But it's the only state in America right now that has an all Democratic congressional delegation and completely run on the state level in terms of the House, the Senate, and the governor by Republicans. That's the split personality of it. So it is a complicated political state and an outlier state at the same time.
I want to hit on a different characteristic of the state that hits near and dear to my heart, especially with Purdue Pharmaceutical and everything that happened 20 years ago. Don't need to get into my father's story, but I think President Trump was quoted as saying New Hampshire's a drug den or something along those.
Yeah. A drug infested den. Yes.
A drug infested den. Yes. And obviously that pissed me off, and I'm sure a lot of others beyond belief. But a little bit more seriously, opiates have been a target of politicians, the senators, the reps that you mentioned. They're trying to fix the problem. Do we know, though, how COVID has influenced the opioid epidemic? And more specifically, is the opioid epidemic as still front of mind and or as big a problem as it was 6-7 years ago?
It's a very good question. And the answer is it is as big of a problem. It's just not perceived as big of a problem. And I'm not talking like, being holier than thou, but fentanyl in particular It's like the number one killer now for certain demographics in New Hampshire and nationwide. Where it gets a little nuanced is that when we talked more about different types of opioids, New Hampshire at one point led the nation in terms of how big of a problem it was. And that was around the time of the drug-infested den comment. He was trying to make an argument for why you needed a border wall because he thought that that's how it would get stopped, even though they come in through different points of entry. But fentanyl does appear to be coming over the border. It is a problem. But right now, politicians are talking about it. But let's say you will see this in the debates when they happen. That in terms of the number one question, it will be about the economy. The second question that's asked, these candidates will be about abortion. About the fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth question will be asked about fentanyl or opioids. Whereas in 2016, 2018, it would have been the number one question. So that's sort of the answer, if that helps to rank where we stand on it.
It does, and I'd like to credit Hugh Gunnison, Mr. John Gunnison's youngest brother, for that thoughtful question. So, John, over to you.
Oh, Justin, thank you so much for giving the credit to Hugh. Came up with an excellent question. James, I wanted to ask about another aspect of New Hampshire's demographic profile and cultural profile that make it a bit distinct. So this is church attendance. We know that the United States generally is relatively religious country compared to some of its peers, but New Hampshire is a little bit unique in this sense.
Second least religious, right?
Indeed, yeah. So New Hampshire is the second least in people say they go to church every week. But if you look at the question that says, do you ever go to church? The category of people who say they never go to church is actually first. And New Hampshire is the only state in the entire country where more than 50% of people said that they never go to church. So, James, can you talk about how this affects the way that New Hampshire behaves politically?
I am so glad you called me out on that, even though that was not your intent. But I should have said, I forgot. I should have said this point because it is absolutely a big deal. It's fascinating. Your brain immediately hears something like that and says, okay, well, that means that social issues don't play well in terms of a social conservative movement. And that is absolutely true. The base of the party is populist. It has never really been social conservative. And in fact, to make up this point, when social conservatives run, they lose every single major office. They have lost. In fact, the last time a social conservative won major office would be 1996, would be Bob Smith. That would be the last time a hardcore social conservative won in the state. And that's a very different time. Now, about 70% consider themselves to be pro-choice, but that's the big picture. In the micro, the way Republicans run for office in most states would be through an evangelical network. At least one candidate would, or you'd have to pay homage to it. That is, they simply, other than there are no mega churches in New Hampshire, which is unlike the rest of the country. There are bigger churches, but I think I've been to 3 in 20 years with a politician.
So, James, we're talking about what the right is not. The right in New Hampshire is not particularly religious or conservative on the social issues that are associated with the religious right. One thing that the right maybe are is libertarian and sometimes extreme libertarian. One of the questions that we crowdsourced here, my sister wanted me to check in on the Free State movement. You could tell us what's going on with the Free State movement right now. And this is my sister, Julia, currently of Brooklyn, New York, who wanted to ask this question.
Julia's question is fascinating for the mere fact that she knows what the Free State Project is. And I don't mean it to be disparaging. It's actually fascinating to me. The Free State Project is something that also started about 15 years ago. The idea was a PhD thesis idea out of Yale. And the concept was, okay, what can libertarians do? I think their most successful presidential candidate was, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. At that point, they are never really a factor. What can be done? Well, what if we use the internet to talk to our fellow libertarians and we came up with one place where everyone could move to? And if we moved there and we all said we are going to be politically engaged, whether donors, super voters, and most importantly, run for office yourself, we could create sort of an ideological utopia because we would have the numbers. So they looked at a couple states, and I think actually it was like 2003. They figured out that they picked New Hampshire. And the idea was, could we get like 25,000 people to move? Over the years, they've got about 10 to 15. And some of those people have moved back to their home state. You think this is kind of weird and how does this work? But it's actually had real world implications, particularly this year. They took over, it was featured in the New York Times. They took over a small town, a husband and wife. That's what we're talking about. No one really is engaged in small town politics as much as people would like to think that they are in a place like New Hampshire. And the husband came up with a plan. He was on the select board, like basically the town council. His wife was running on the school board, and they slashed the school budget by 50%. 50, not 1-5, 50. The town was like, wait, what just happened? They revolted. They shut down a very popular and very big revenue-inducing publicly owned ski resort in the Lakes region. And overall, they're having people run for office consistently. So what is a unique bug and a feature, actually, the Republican Party is not in New Hampshire. And this is where it is completely different. And this is where a lot of people will get the next presidential primary wrong. The New Hampshire Republican Party is not defined by your position on Trump. And I know it is in Arizona. I know it is in Georgia. I know it is in Connecticut. I know it is in pick your state. In New Hampshire, it's defined by, are you with the Free Staters or are you not? They are not. It has not been a hugely successful movement, but it has been successful enough that it has almost taken over the party. So Chris Sununu, the popular Republican governor, every day has to battle not with Trumpers, but with the Free Staters, who now control the New Hampshire House. And that has had some wild implications, particularly when it comes to abortion, because they are libertarian, though some are more pro-life than others. I mean, Rand Paul is a pro-life, but that is sort of an interesting dynamic. Where are they at now? They are both the most powerful that they've ever been. And with that power has become a lot of criticism, and I'm not sure they're handling that well.
So, James, we're going to talk soon about Sununu and how he's interacting with these activists, but I want to follow up and ask a little bit more about the Free Staters and these other kind of quasi-militia movements. One person who was a Free Stater was a gentleman named, and I use the term gentleman a little bit loosely here, gentleman named Chris Cantwell. This was a guy who became famous as the crying Nazi in the Vice documentary about Charlottesville. He moved to New Hampshire to join the Free State Project. And his participation in that and his connection to the Free Staters, and, I don't mean to tar everyone with this negative brush here, but it does remind us about how there are sometimes affiliations with violence or interest in doing acts of violence or political revolution among the extreme libertarian set. We can also remember the Brown family in New Hampshire, Edward and Elaine Brown, who created a fortress in their house and said they would kill federal agents if they tried to make them pay taxes. James, right now, an issue that's getting a lot of national attention for very good reason is the issue of domestic terrorism and how some sects of the MAGA movement seem interested in using violence as, in their eyes, a legitimate tool of political change. Because of New Hampshire's history with these sorts of extremists, I'm wondering if the risk of violent devolution of politics is particularly acute in the state.
Well, look, I got to say this. That's a very good, very historical. We mentioned the Browns, so good for you. I know a lot of Free Staters. I know the leadership of the Free State to the degree. I follow them very closely. They are not violent. There are members who are drawn to their cause that may be violent. So that's the difference. This is not the Proud Boys, is what I'm trying to say, who are drawn to the conflict. They are drawn to ideological conflict. And I think where they can go off the rails is they are so pure in loving an idea that they are bad at the people consequences of being that more than a violent type. But there's no question that there are some who run for office who have quite, as free staters, and quite the criminal record. So, but again, it's not, the leadership is not out there every day saying, we must take this by arms. That is, the language and the rhetoric is different than it is with other extremist groups. But of course, I think everyone's concerned in any hamlet about the potential for violence. I mean, unfortunately, kids going to school are nervous about, the threat of violence, as we never solved that problem either. So for school shootings. So, I mean, yes, violence is everywhere, but I do not think that the leadership of the Free State Movement has been driving that.
So you've mentioned no social conservative has won in New Hampshire since Bob Smith. You've also mentioned Governor Sununu a little bit and how he's battling with these free staters. So let's just jump right into Governor Sununu. He has a moderate persona or perception nationally. We know that he's moderate socially because he wouldn't have won otherwise, as you let us know. Other than going on Sunday talk shows and hewing that, I wouldn't say anti-Trump line, but definitely not that pro-Trump line. And then also having that middle way during COVID and the way that he dealt with it when others were shutting all the way down, or folks like Governor DeSantis were basically saying, fuck you, pardon my language, to the press and everybody around them and liberals. Is Governor Sununu policy-wise, like tax cuts and other policies, moderate, or like Susan Collins and folks that people would characterize as being Northeast Republicans? Is he more conservative? How should we truly understand Governor Sununu and his ideology?
I mean, look, if we're starting to lose listeners who are like, this is enough New Hampshire, let me stop you for a second from turning off, because Chris Sununu, and I'm only biased because he's a person I cover, but because I cover him, I've covered every election he's ever been in. I've known him since before he's in office. He's definitely the most fascinating Republican in American politics right now. Because as you, Justin, right there, struggled to try to define exactly where he fits in all of this, because you can't define it. It's not a problem with you. It's how fascinating Sununu is. There is no politician in America, no Republican in America that has better managed the Donald Trump dynamic than he has. Trump, he is both not a Trumper, and Trump has not attacked him. Corey Lewandowski lives in New Hampshire. Obviously, he ran his first campaign. He and Sununu hate each other. Lewandowski's out there saying Donald Trump wants to find someone to primary Chris Sununu. Donald Trump does not want to look around to try to find someone to primary Chris Sununu, and he never did, because he couldn't, and he would lose. And he's also not that upset with them. So where does he fit? It's complicated. He is an old school establishment Republican from the Northeast. Okay. So what I mean by that is he is low taxes. He is essentially libertarian in mindset, and he'll tell you that in terms of live free or die. He's not going to go around and change the gay marriage law. He did help pass one of the first ever bans on late-term abortions that ever existed in the state history. But he did it as part of his state budget, and he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he vetoed it the first time it ended up on his desk. He's not going to go out of his way. He's also not someone who says, I am a moderate. He would never say that. That's what's so interesting about him. He's perceived as a moderate, but he's never described himself that way. And he also knows who he is. So he is, during COVID, for example, the classic line from Republicans around the country was about all the mandates. And so there was this moment, and it was very fascinating, completely unscripted, just him speaking at it was called an executive council meeting, which I know you guys know what that means, but we're not going to get into it for the audience, where one of his fellow Republicans, a person he knows very well, was saying, we're going to not allow businesses to make, or schools, I forget which one it was businesses. We're going to ban, follow the logic, we're going to ban businesses from requiring you to wear a mask, okay? Because we were for freedom. And forget the COVID politics. Chris Sununu is like, the government doesn't tell businesses what to do. We are for limited government. And limited government says businesses can decide whether damn well what they wanted to have a mask or not. And it was this long tirade among getting killed by protesters during COVID from the right. And he just wasn't having it. And it was from a genuine place. That was a long answer on Chris Sununu. I'm sorry.
No, this is great because we're going to zoom back out to national to recapture our international and national listeners.
Chris Sununu is an international guy, Justin. Lebanon, Cuba, El Salvador.
Yes, well, he's not, but he's more Washington, D.C. with his dad in Thomas Jefferson High School. But nonetheless, Chris Sununu may run for president.
That's what I want to get into. To zoom back out, and this is my characterization from my personal experience working, in presidential political races. And also just speaking to people on this podcast, you need to, whether by hook or by crook, get a sizable faction of voters to support you to survive the Republican Party. You need to get momentum in early states, not always, but you need momentum to be able to build on fundraising, to be able to outlast people in a primary with 19 candidates. So that leads us to our question. It looks like Ron DeSantis is an early front runner. It looks like the GOP voters in the primary, the energy is squarely with the MAGA folks, because if you look at the 2016 race, it was between Ted Cruz, one of the founders of the Tea Party in DC, and Donald Trump, so two extremists. And then that leads us to our question here, because folks like Marco Rubio, who was originally a Tea Party member, and then Jeb Bush, who was moderate, John Kasich, they all sucked. They had no chance in hell. They didn't have a snowball's chance in hell. So back to the question, does Chris Sununu have either great retail politics, authenticity, and the mantra of a fighter where he could gain some support from those MAGA folks, from those libertarian folks that gravitate towards Ron DeSantis's FU mentality? Is he able to maybe pick off some conservatives or some moderates? Long-winded, but the question is, do you see it possible that Sununu could cobble together a coalition in the more extreme GOP national primary and actually be a viable candidate outside of fundraising?
Yeah, outside of fundraising, because he's not a very good fundraiser. So we should talk about that. But he hasn't needed the money. There are a lot of reasons why people run for president. I think our last conversation, we went through the numbers, right? So in 2016, 17 Republicans ran for president. Obviously, Donald Trump became the nominee. In 2020, 23 Democrats ran for president. This time around, we don't know if it's going to be Biden and Trump. Probably not. But if it's not, everyone who's the mayor of a city like Manchester will say, wait, Pete Buttigieg, I could be the next Pete Buttigieg. I should run. We are going to have so many people running for president, and very few of them actually running to become president.
Cabinet secretary. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Cabinet secretary, selling books, have a show on Fox or MSNBC, or run a group. Who knows? Okay. Chris Sununu, if you get him drunk, doesn't really know what he wants to do next. He knows he's one of the three most popular governors in America. He knows like you said, he's got a complicated brand that he's cultivated. So it's not obvious what he's supposed to do next. He knows his father, right? We haven't talked about that, right? His father was a governor who became a White House chief of staff because he endorsed really well in the presidential primary, George H.W. Bush, and became his chief of staff. That's a path to be nationally relevant. And his brother, of course, became a congressman and U.S. Senator, John E. Sununu. So I don't think he even knows what comes next. But he wants to be in the game. And so running for president may be the way to do that. The major, major complicating factor is that if he runs, he kind of messes up the New Hampshire primary, which is something he should never, ever, no New Hampshire politician should do. And again, the last person who ran for president from New Hampshire in a serious way was Bob Smith. We're going back to him again. It would be a bad idea that way. I think he's not. I don't know if he's going to run. He may tease it. They continue to run around the country. And at the end of the day, not and try to endorse well. But I mean, he's several terms in now. He's running for his fourth term as governor. At some point, he doesn't want to do that again, but he's got a lot of political capital. I don't think he knows what he wants to do.
So there's a saying in New Hampshire for our listeners, John and James know it very well. It was showing the mental acuity of the Sununus when they're running. It's who knew Sununu? James, it sounds like Sununu doesn't know this time.
No, I mean, look, he knows he's ambitious. Look, politicians and you, human beings, my dear listeners, one of the jobs is to preserve options. Do you want to stay in your current job or do you want to go for someone else? I'm not going to translate this into dating because that's a whole other thing, but you want to preserve your options, right? He's preserving his options right now. And I don't think he knows, and politics changes so quickly. I mean, for example, everyone was trying to get him to run against Maggie Hassan for Senate. He got out in mid-November, right after the midterms. Right after the New Jersey and Virginia election last November. The landscape he was looking at, I thought he would beat Maggie Hassan in a swing state, an incumbent Democratic senator, by 5 points. I don't think there's even a question about it. Now, it's a different world. Do I think he'd win? Maybe. I think so. So calculations change all the time, and we'll see where we're at after the midterm elections.
So I hope that we haven't lost all of our international listeners while we were talking about Chris Sununu. And James, I only referenced Sununu's international appeal a minute ago for personal reasons, because as frequent listeners of this program probably know, until the pandemic, I was working in the TV industry in the Middle East. And every so often, some of my coworkers from Lebanon or Syria would ask me, what do people in America know about the Arab world? What do people think about the Arab world? And I would be able to tell them, George or Assad or whoever. In my home state, our 3 statewide officials are named Sununu, Shaheen, and Hassan.
Hassan apparently is Irish. So I don't know. But yes. You still got the name. Yes. Right.
But let's talk about a figure that is definitely known internationally, if not even intergalactically. And that's Donald Trump. This is a crowdsourced question from my brother Bert of Toronto, Canada. He wants to know what role Donald Trump played in the primaries, especially the Senate primary. You mentioned, James, that Trump isn't really the big factor, whether you're with him or against him in these primary races. But, can you tell us a little bit about the role he did play? Did he make an endorsement? Did it matter?
Just absolutely fascinating. Donald Trump never really hesitated to make endorsements. This is how he was going to stay relevant in the Republican Party. So state by state, beginning in, I think the first state was Texas, I think that had primaries. Could be wrong about that, but one of the first ones, every single time, the dynamic is, did Donald Trump endorse and who did he endorse and how did that impact? He didn't know what to do. New Hampshire had 3 really competitive races. New Hampshire has 2 congressional seats, it's a small state, and the Senate race. He did not endorse in any of them. They all had competitive primaries, and they were all very competitive primaries. So if you wanted to pick the winner, I couldn't tell you who that was going to be. And of course, by the time the primary came around, because it's the latest primary out there, Trump missed his last greatest chance to endorse in a primary this cycle, in which was in New Hampshire. His house is getting raided. So I'm not sure they really wanted his endorsement by the end of it. Yeah, he was a non-factor.
And you did mention the 3 close primary races. In my words, we had 3 extremists emerge in the Senate. You got Bullock, you got Burns in House District 2, and those are 2 districts that Democrats spent outside money on to elevate those extremists. And then in the 1st district, where I'm from, you have Caroline Leavitt, who really seems like a child in that she's 25 years old. On her campaign website, she praises how hard she worked on her job application to the White House, which just seems very out of scale for somebody running to represent the most powerful country in the world in a federal legislature. So that is to say that if Trump wasn't the unifying factor for these extremists to get elected, what was? Was there any unifying factor?
I mean, look, I said he was not a direct factor. He was absolutely the indirect, baked-in factor in these races. Bob Burns is very close to Lewandowski. I don't know if he officially worked on the Trump campaign in 2016. I saw him in the office. Maybe he did. I've known Bob for a very long time. Caroline Leavitt in the 1st district, she was a former, Trump assistant press secretary. running against a former Trump State Department official and running against Scott Brown's wife, Gail Huff Brown, a very well-known television reporter in the state, but obviously served as an ambassador in the Trump administration. Everyone was all Trump. So to some level, he didn't have to endorse. He was endorsing hard because they were all speaking from the same language. And of course, Bulldog, who never got the Trump endorsement, but was sharing a lot of the same supporters. So it was a decently attended, decently voted in terms of turnout. In some of these cases, except for Bob Burns, multiple candidates. So actually, in Bob Burns' case, it ended up being a three-way race. The third person ended up getting around 15%, I think it was. So that obviously helped them win with the Trump base.
I've got a question for you here about General Bolduc. And this is our last crowdsourced question. This question comes from my father, Michael Gunnison, currently of Doha, Qatar. And he asks that he heard that General Bolduc had done research about the 2020 election.
Yes.
Do you happen to know what research General Bolduc had been conducting? And can you tell us about the role of the press in pushing him on this particular topic?
So we're missing a lot of context. Great question. He doubled down, said he will never waver. He's always going to be on the horse, I think is the term, to always say the election was stolen from Donald Trump. He signed a letter with 120 other, he's a former brigadier general of the Army, with other generals basically saying the election was stolen. This was one of his main talking points throughout 2 years of running for president, running for Senate. And then he becomes the nominee. And the next day on the local television station, he says, well, did some research. And now that I'm a general election candidate, I figured out that actually the election was not stolen. It was not local TV. It was on Fox News. And then days after that, a little week after that, he's back on some conservative podcast walking that back. So his position is murky at best.
We see that he's struggling with consistency, with sticking to a narrative, with understanding what voters want, with, making that claim for 2 years, walking it back, and then walking back the walk back. What about Caroline Leavitt? I know I made a quip about her ridiculous bio, which just does not seem fitting for the office that she's running for, but how is her campaign being run? And more so, is it being perceived as serious and her as a serious person by some of the independents in the state, which really are important voters in New Hampshire?
A lot of questions in that one question. Number one, tactically speaking, look, she's run a great campaign. She defeated the nominee from 2 years ago in the primary, who everyone thought was easily going to be the nominee once again. She had a late surge. She's raised a ton of money, which again, for a 25-year-old, okay. She's very disciplined on message. She will work on it and work on the campaign. So good for her. Whether she is being perceived as a serious candidate, I don't think we know that yet, to be honest with you, as we take this episode right now, because she is being taken serious as a standard bearer Republican nominee. It is notable that the Governor Sununu, as we mentioned before, did endorse her just a few days before this podcast, still is not endorsed in the 2nd congressional district. So he at least sees that she's going to be on the team. It's a late primary. She will have the requisite money she needs to run a serious campaign. How people see her as a general election candidate, I don't know.
So you mentioned earlier that if Sununu ran against Hassan way back, what was it, in February, you mentioned he'd win by 5 points. Obviously, the national temperature has changed. And you had a great article today and a poll out, which our listeners can find in the link to this episode. I subscribe to the Boston Globe. I believe it's $1, folks. So if you want to read James' national view on politics, his state level view, I suggest you subscribe. That's my only shill for this podcast. But subscribe to the Globe. It's super cheap and great. But that is to say, generally speaking, you can give it to us in each district. You can give it to us throughout the state. How has the atmosphere changed since gas prices have been declining and also Roe v. Wade coming out? Can you just characterize if the Democrats are still on the upswing, if the Republicans are starting to regain ground, and what you see from the poll that you just wrote about?
On Sunday, the past Sunday, was the 100-day mark after Dobbs. And when Dobbs came out, I'm going to say something. I was wrong. I'll be intellectually consistent. I was wrong. I thought, obviously, there would be a short-term political impact, but for those who are fired up about this issue, many of them are voting anyway. You can only vote once, no matter what Donald Trump has said about our elections, and you can't stab through that bullet harder than once. That is not what's happened. Dobbs has completely upended the situation. Obviously, gas prices have gone down now almost, I think, also like almost 100 days as well. But now we're seeing an amazing amount, particularly among independent women who are registering to vote, who are fired up. You saw it obviously from Kansas through different special elections in Texas after that, and I think it was in Oregon after that as well, New York too. You've seen this tremendous energy in the party. Now, Republicans used to have about a 25-point, in fact, it was the largest point gap of the enthusiasm gap, is what pollsters say. How excited are you to vote in this election? And it was, I think in the spring, it was the highest that had ever been recorded in terms of the gap between Republicans and Democrats. And now Republicans have about a 10-point gap, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it is nothing where we were in the spring. What I wonder is, as people are listening to this on Tuesday and next week, is whether or not Democrats have actually peaked. This may be the high watermark as we head in things may turn more in the favor of Republicans. But as we've been discussing in New Hampshire in particular, but in other states as well, the Mitch McConnell quote from August about candidate quality, it has been a definite factor. If Republicans are not seen as a viable alternative, then this is going to be really difficult for Republicans.
Yeah, so I worked for a pro-life member that was always up for the March of Life in Congress, and just witnessed the fervor and energy that these folks organized around on abortion. And John had your view, and also we had Tim Carney on and a few others that didn't think it would upend the race. I thought it would totally upend the race, just because these Republicans were working towards something concrete, and the Democrats never had a concrete, true fear of abortion being rolled back nationally, because a lot of folks grew up with it as a right. And now we are seeing this type of seismic shift. And I want to get into one of the candidates and an elected senator who was helped arguably the most by this ruling, Maggie Hassan. You wrote in your article today that she's been unpopular since she beat Kelly Ayotte. Can you go into why? She was governor.
Yeah, she was governor. She defeated a social conservative on her way in. I mean, number one, she's by the time she runs for governor, she loses 2 out of 5 races for state senate. She takes on a person that Jeanne Shaheen beat when she ran in 1996. As a well-known social conservative, that's what he is. That's who he is. And they ran up the score on it. She was able to win that way. She then faced in her reelection. She only won 2 terms. Basically a carpetbagger who had money but was really a bad candidate. So she got lucky. And then she got lucky again when she ran against Kelly Ayotte, because the Libertarian candidates basically were the reason why she won by that, and Donald Trump tanking in New Hampshire, because it was 2016, is the reason why she became U.S. Senator by 1,000 votes. But after that, so the branding wasn't always there for her, but she was seen as a milquetoast generic Democrat who's boring. There was no difference between Maggie Hassan, Democrat, and Mary Smith, Democrat. And so there was no passion there for a reason why you needed to support Maggie Hassan. I think her story actually is very interesting. She just doesn't sell it very well. But what's been completely interesting is that in this particular cycle, she knew this was a problem. So again, I'm calling her unpopular. Let's put numbers behind it. It's not my opinion. She's consistently ranking around a 40% approval rating. Sometimes she was in the 30s. Rarely was she ever above 45. So the most fascinating thing I thought personally about this poll that the Boston Globe and Suffolk University released was that her favorability rating, do you like her, was it positive 4.5%, which is a remarkable story, and frankly something by the time this podcast comes out will have published something about, because this is what I'm working on now. I'm absolutely fascinated with that statistic, which I didn't even note in my story today. I'm saving it. But if you look around the country, Mark Kelly, an astronaut, obviously insulated from a lot of political pressures in a swing state, he's more people do not like him than like him. Raphael Warnock, I mean, you may think he's a Democrat, a socialist, whatever you want to call him, but I mean, he's got a great life story, good speaker. He's got ads with puppy dogs. He's also more unliked than liked. But Maggie Hassan has spent about $24 million on television ads trying to improve her image. And it's worked despite the fact that about, I think, 36 million in negative ads have gone against her. It's the most expensive race in New Hampshire history. We always knew that was going to be. But we're not even really debating Don Bolduc as much as we're debating who the heck is Maggie Hassan and do I like her? So that's sort of the subtext here.
Going in on that, there are many different communication strategies, but I'm wondering, so is it her ability to sell herself, to sell a narrative, to do retail politics that is maybe a problem, or is she being hidden by her comm staff? Specifically, you have folks that do hide from the media. I'm thinking of the senator in Nevada, John, I'm going to butcher her name, so I won't even say it.
Oh, Catherine Cortez Masto?
Thank you, Cortez Masto. I've been being a little dyslexic today with Masto Cortez. And we had John Ralston from the Nevada Independent on. He's amazing, and he was not mincing words with the problems that she has.
Another one would be Gary Peters, another example. He got knocked for that too.
Yep. Is it she's not selling herself outside of these TV ads, or is it the comm staff just doing the opposite of what Liz Smith did with Mayor Pete, and that now that you see with a lot of politicians, which is go everywhere all the time, no matter what, let's get FaceTime, we can do it, we're competent. Like, what's going on? Comm strategy or just natural abilities of the candidate?
I would not describe, I've also known Maggie before she's ever been elected.
Not to burn your sources.
No, I mean, I intimately can answer this question. I think I can. Maybe, obviously, for people to disagree, but 20 years of Maggie Hassan, she is not very good as a retail candidate. She is not very, and so some people are not good at retail, but they can give an awesome speech. And I'm talking about Barack Obama, right? Not very good at retail. Oh my gosh. And in 2008, the man could give a speech. Donald Trump famously refuses to even spend the night in New Hampshire, does not want to do any retail politics, and did know retail politics. But boy, could you have a rally. Would it be entertaining? Maggie Hassan does not do retail, and she cannot give a speech. But what she is doing is she is perfectly executing what we'll call the Jean Shaheen model, which is put your head down, raise the money, tactically run a campaign that does not upset the left so much. I mean, upset the left because you're running towards the center, and you're going to brand yourself as sort of a reasonable Democrat. So running for governor and everything else would take would take a pledge in New Hampshire. Another way New Hampshire is weird because it doesn't have an income tax or sales tax, and Democrats have tried to change that, but she won't do it, and any successful Democrat won't pledge to change that. But there's no particular reason to get out of bed in the morning and be like, I have to make Maggie Hassan a senator for another 6 years. I think there are reasons why people should. And so that may be her or her team not selling that. I think there are reasons why I like Maggie Hassan a lot as a human being, but she does not sell those attributes. She's like, I am milquetoast. I am the reason why Democrats can have the majority, and I am not going to say or do anything that makes me interesting.
I am lukewarm water, but I also like her. So all just aside.
Yes.
So, James, we're just going to ask you one more question. You've been so generous here with your time. This is another one that's a little bit big picture, medium term question. New Hampshire, we talked about it being so different demographically from all these other states in the United States. That's become a relevant talking point in part because of the first in the nation primary, which has become controversial. What's the status right now? Do we think that New Hampshire are going to be first in the nation going into the next election cycle?
Well, I know what John Ralston said when you talked to him about it, without even listening to it. I think we asked this question incorrectly. And I think we talk about this question incorrectly. Will New Hampshire have the first of the nation primary in 2024 and beyond? The answer is yes, it will. New Hampshire will host the first primary. It's in the state law. It's the ethos. It is demanded that is what will happen. The question isn't whether it's first. The question is whether it matters. It's a very complicated thing to explain to our international listeners how the primary season works and who decides what and which order of states go in. But the bottom of the line is that if the Democratic National Committee wants to decide that the New Hampshire primary will get no delegates to the national convention, which is the only point of that primary, and every other primary in the country, because they want it to start somewhere else, and that's when they'll start counting delegates. That is their right. Now, the question becomes, and New Hampshire will still host the first primary. The question is, will candidates show up, and will the media cover it? And those are questions I do not know. But as long as the status quo is that the Democrats have not made a decision, then clearly New Hampshire will continue its status. And where it gets complicated is that Republicans are continuing to have the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucuses, just as they always have. So it'll be this weird situation if Democrats don't, because there'll be endless stories about, Democrats in disarray and like, okay, we have a winner in New Hampshire, and does that mean anything? Well, we don't know. Versus talking, this is the decision they're going to have to make, talking about the person who actually won and their ideas for the country.
There's an implication here that's pretty interesting, James. It's that the subtext of what you're saying, an important point, New Hampshire's swing state status is protecting the first in the nation primary. Because New Hampshire is a competitive state, both party committees don't want to piss off New Hampshire because there's 4 electoral votes on the line. And now that Iowa is moving further into the red column, it becomes a little bit more vulnerable to be displaced. But New Hampshire, you have to be a little bit careful.
It is not the only factor, but it is absolutely a factor. That's absolutely right.